Good evening from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now. Welcome to our live coverage for another launch attempt for SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket. You're looking at a live view of the Falcon Heavy standing out on pad 39A this evening, an hour and 10 minutes roughly until liftoff time. SpaceX has already moved this launch back tonight to the end of tonight's launch window. So liftoff is currently scheduled for 8:26 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 12:26 a.m. UTC. This will be the third launch attempt for this mission, following scrubs last week on Thursday and Friday. Thursday due to weather issues, severe weather here on Florida's Space Coast. And on Friday, SpaceX has not said the reason for an abort that occurred at about the T-minus 1 minute mark in the countdown for the Falcon Heavy, although we understand the issue had something to do with the launch vehicle, but no details from SpaceX. We hope to learn more perhaps when they bring up their live coverage a few minutes before liftoff tonight. And again, another delay tonight. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the launch time has been adjusted from the opening of the window, which was at 7:29 p.m. Eastern, and now is at the end of tonight's window at 8:26 p.m. Eastern. So any additional delay tonight in the countdown would result in a scrub and a delay until at least tomorrow for the next launch attempt for this mission. The goal of tonight's mission is to deliver 3 spacecraft into a near geosynchronous orbit, more than 21,000 miles over the equator. This will take nearly 5 hours for the Falcon Heavy to complete that job. That will include, after the 3 first-stage boosters complete their burns, that will be followed by 3 firings of the upper stage engine to maneuver these 3 spacecraft into a circular orbit over the equator, and then the 3 spacecraft will deploy one at a time from the Falcon Heavy's upper stage. At that point, the last of the 3 would deploy about 4 hours, 45 minutes into the flight. That'll be shortly after 1 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 a.m. UTC, if this launch gets off the ground as scheduled. The primary payload on this mission, and by far the largest, is the ViaSat 3 Americas internet satellite. It weighs more than 6 metric tons, more than 13,000 pounds, and is taking up much of the volume inside the payload fairing of the Falcon Heavy tonight. ViaSat 3 Americas is the first of 3 virtually identical satellites that ViaSat is developing in partnership with Boeing, the spacecraft manufacturer, to provide global broadband service over the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Asia-Pacific regions. This particular satellite, the first of the group of 3, will be positioned over the Americas, providing internet service over North America, South America, the Caribbean, and neighboring maritime waters. Consumers that will be using the ViaSat 3 network include airline passengers, cruise ship passengers, maritime operators, shipping operators, as well as consumers that are in rural areas around the United States and around other countries in the Americas, and also communities and schools and businesses that are operating outside the reach of fiber connectivity on the ground. ViaSat's network is in competition in many ways with SpaceX's own Starlink internet service, which is using a fleet of thousands of low Earth orbiting spacecraft that are individually much less powerful than the ViaSat 3 satellite we're seeing launching this evening, but collectively do provide that high-speed, low-latency internet connectivity. Also noteworthy, we've seen many Starlink launches on SpaceX Falcon 9s this year, Falcon 9 rockets this year. One thing to note, on Friday we saw the launch of 2 broadband satellites owned by the Luxembourg-based operator SES. These are part of SES's O3b mPOWER network, which are a fleet of satellites flying in a medium Earth orbit. So in between the Starlink altitude and the ViaSat altitude, in a medium altitude range about 5,000 miles above the equator. Also, those satellites have a similar mission as ViaSat and Starlink, providing internet service. So you're seeing 3 different approaches providing internet service from space in action, with recent launches from Cape Canaveral with Starlink, with OneWeb We saw those launches earlier this year. And in medium Earth orbit, O3b, and in geosynchronous orbit, we're seeing ViaSat. We're about an hour, 5 minutes, and 36 seconds now from liftoff of the Falcon Heavy. The main concern that we're aware of this evening is winds here at the spaceport. Ground winds have been gusting regularly over 30 knots this afternoon. That is close to the limit for a Falcon Heavy launch. SpaceX also, we believe, is monitoring upper-level winds in the upper atmosphere that could pose a problem for the Falcon Heavy's steering through the atmosphere as it climbs into space. Those upper-level winds are monitored throughout the countdown by a series of weather balloons launched from over at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Those balloons have been sent aloft throughout the afternoon, monitoring direction and wind speed at different altitudes. In about 10 to 15 minutes or so, at the T-minus 50-minute mark, in fact, just under 15 minutes from now, is when SpaceX should begin loading propellants into the Falcon Heavy rocket. Before that milestone, the SpaceX launch team here at Kennedy Space Center will be polled for their readiness to proceed into that propellant loading sequence. If you're just joining us, and you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That really helps us attract a larger audience for our coverage, as we're now a little more than an hour away from the launch of SpaceX's 6th Falcon Heavy rocket. The Falcon Heavy still holds the mantle as the most powerful, currently operational commercial rocket in the world. It's now been surpassed in the last few months by a couple of launches of NASA's Space Launch System moon rocket and SpaceX's next generation Starship launch vehicle. We've seen those rockets lift off on their first test flights recently. So Falcon Heavy now in 3rd place of most powerful operational rockets, most powerful rockets that have flown, at least currently flying. But it's the only commercial rocket currently in operational service and available for purchase by satellite operators around the world.
Launch director and countdown. At polls complete, we are go to proceed with propellant load and launch. Reminder on abort instructions. For not urgent, no-go conditions, brief C or LD and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operator shall call hold in a countdown net. Launch control abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed to launch abort. T-minus 10 seconds, launch control be hands off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
Now 52 minutes, 34 seconds and counting. We just heard the call from SpaceX's launch director. The readiness poll of SpaceX's launch team is complete, and all stations reported their go to proceed into the automated launch sequencer beginning at T-minus 50 minutes. In just a couple of minutes from now, that's when the propellant loading sequence will begin. The first phase of tanking operations will be the loading of kerosene fuel, rocket-grade kerosene, into the Falcon Heavy's 3 first-stage boosters.
Falcon Heavy tanks are venting for the start of prop load. Launch auto sequence has started.
T-minus 49 minutes, 49 seconds and counting. We just heard the voice call from SpaceX Launch Control that the launch auto sequence has started. So kerosene fuel is now being pumped into the 3 first-stage boosters out at Pad 39A. This is beginning the propellant loading process this evening. We saw this also occur back on Friday night with the previous launch attempt for this mission. That'll be followed in a few minutes by the start of cryogenic liquid oxygen loading. "48 minutes, 30 seconds and counting now until the launch of SpaceX's 6th flight of a Falcon Heavy rocket. This countdown marks the third, depending on how you count it, the third launch attempt for this Falcon Heavy rocket for the ViaSat 3 Americas mission. The launch was originally scheduled for back on April the 8th, nearly more than 3 weeks ago now, but SpaceX delayed the flight about 10 days to address a concern with the second stage of the Falcon Heavy rocket. With that concern behind them, SpaceX rolled the Falcon Heavy without its payload shroud, without the satellites on board, to Pad 39A for a static fire test on April the 13th. We're going to watch a replay of that static fire test now that occurred back on the 13th of April. This involved the ignition of 27 engines on the 3 first-stage boosters of the Falcon Heavy. There you see the plume of exhaust coming out of the flame trench at Pad 39A back on April 13th. Coming out of this test, SpaceX decided they needed to swap a couple of engines on the Falcon Heavy. That was done and delayed the launch till April the 26th. And then last week, SpaceX has delayed the mission a few more times. Back on Thursday, we had a severe weather event here at Kennedy Space Center where lightning struck the launch pad tower during the countdown. This view comes from a camera set up by our photographer Michael Kane. Hear the crack of thunder there from Michael Kane's camera out at the launch pad 39A area. That was on Thursday. SpaceX called off the countdown before they even started loading propellant due to that weather. And then on Friday, SpaceX aborted the countdown at T-minus 59 seconds with the propellants already fully loaded into the Falcon Heavy rocket. We believe that abort was called due to some kind of concern with the launch vehicle, although we're not entirely sure of the exact issue. SpaceX did not give any detail whatsoever before they signed off their webcast on Friday night. And now SpaceX is set up for another launch attempt tonight. They skipped a launch opportunity yesterday due to a forecast also of severe weather. It's been a very dynamic weather pattern, very active weather pattern here on Florida's Space Coast for the last few days. Tonight, though, a front has pushed through. It's a little bit cooler, much drier, perfectly clear sky overhead, a moon hanging high in the sky over the southeast horizon here on Florida's Space Coast, and a cloudless evening with some gusty winds that were a concern earlier in the countdown here at Kennedy Space Center, but those winds have died down somewhat, and SpaceX now says there's a 95% chance of acceptable weather for the Falcon Heavy to get off the ground tonight. Liftoff remains scheduled for the end of tonight's launch window at 8:26 p.m. Eastern Time or 12:26 a.m. UTC. We're coming up on the next milestone in the countdown, which will be the start of liquid oxygen loading on the 3 first-stage boosters of the Falcon Heavy.
Center core PY/NY LOX load has started.
Now inside of 39 minutes until liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket. Here's a view of the Falcon Heavy's 27 first stage engines inside the SpaceX hangar just south of Pad 39A. This photo was taken earlier this month during pre-launch processing. Each of these engines produces nearly 200,000 pounds of thrust at sea level. They burn kerosene and liquid oxygen. And there are 9 engines clustered in an what's known as an octaweb formation on each of the 3 first stage boosters. You'll notice if you look toward the bottom, no landing legs are integrated on these rockets, so these boosters will be expended, as we mentioned earlier in our coverage. Also, there are no grid fins on the boosters, so they will be impacting the Atlantic Ocean at high speed. All 3 boosters will not be recovered on tonight's mission because of the requirement to put these 3 satellites, the largest of which is more than 6 metric tons in mass, into a very high circular equatorial orbit just shy of geosynchronous altitude at more than 20,000 miles over the equator. These photos were taken of the Falcon Heavy a few days ago by our photographer Michael Kane while he was out there setting up sound-triggered remote cameras around the launch site. You can see the ViaSat logo on the payload fairing. The payload fairing, SpaceX will attempt to recover that on tonight's mission. There's a recovery vessel stationed about 1,000 miles downrange in the Atlantic Ocean to attempt to retrieve the 2 halves of the payload shroud after it jettisons from the rocket a few minutes into the mission. Those 2 fairing halves will parachute back to Earth and splash down in the Atlantic, and SpaceX will be there to attempt to retrieve those and bring them back to the Cape for refurbishment and reuse. We mentioned this is the 6th launch of a Falcon Heavy rocket. Here's a look back at those previous 5 missions. Many of you may remember the very exciting debut demo mission for Falcon Heavy on February the 6th of 2018 that sent one of Elon Musk's Tesla Roadsters along with a spacesuit-clad mannequin into interplanetary space on a demo flight, successfully proving that the Falcon Heavy works. And then a little more than a year later, Falcon Heavy entered commercial service for Arabsat with a mission with a Saudi Arabian communications satellite. It launched its first mission for the U.S. military a few months later. In June of 2019, the Space Test Program 2 mission with about 24 satellites heading up to orbit for the Defense Department and NASA. And then most recently, after a gap of more than 3 years of Falcon Heavy missions, we've seen 2 Falcon Heavies in the last 6 months or so for the U.S. Space Force. Those were semi-classified missions, each carrying secret payloads to a geostationary orbit. And then Falcon Heavy tonight is back in commercial action for Viasat with the Viasat 3 America's broadband satellite on board, heading up to a similar geostationary orbit. Geostationary orbit, of course, is where spacecraft orbits the Earth over the equator in lockstep with the planet's rotation, giving that satellite a fixed field of view over a specific region of the Earth and allowing antennas on the ground to be pointed up at the same point in the sky to connect with that spacecraft.
Stage 2 RP1 load has started.
Now inside of 35 minutes until liftoff, SpaceX has just confirmed that the kerosene load on the 2nd stage of the Falcon Heavy is now underway. So now 7 of the 8 propellant tanks on board the Falcon Heavy are being filled for flight, with the fuel and oxidizer tanks on the 3 first stage boosters being loaded, as well as the fuel tank on the 2nd stage. The liquid oxygen tank on stage 2 will begin loading at about 18.5 minutes in the countdown, about 16 minutes from now. Concurrently with the loading of propellant, SpaceX is also loading cryogenic helium into the Falcon Heavy that's stored in these high-pressure tanks or composite overwrapped pressure vessels. The helium is injected into the propellant tanks during flight to maintain pressure as propellants are consumed. Again, if you're just joining us and haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button. That really helps us out quite a bit to attract a larger audience for our coverage of the Falcon Heavy countdown and launch this evening. So thumbs up or like on YouTube here on our stream really helps us a lot. We'd appreciate that support. Also, another way to support our coverage is to click the join button under our stream here on our YouTube channel. If you do that, you'll get a menu of various membership levels to choose from. Depending on which one you choose, you can gain access to bonus members-only video features that we've produced just for our loyal supporters. And you'll be helping us continue our coverage because we need your support for camera equipment, for human resources, for all sorts of technical gear, and our time to bring you this live coverage. Now 32 minutes, 40 seconds remaining in the countdown. Beautiful evening here on Florida's Space Coast as SpaceX prepares for launch of the Falcon Heavy. We're seeing some news media and photographers gathering on the press site lawn here at Kennedy Space Center, preparing to cover this launch, which is shaping up to be a twilight ascent into orbit. Just across the road from my location here at Kennedy Space Center is the Launch Control Center, where the SpaceX engineers are gathered in Firing Room 4 to oversee this evening's countdown. That Launch Control Center sits just in the shadow of the iconic vehicle assembly building here at Kennedy. Now 27 minutes and counting until liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket. The main payload for this mission is ViaSat 3 Americas. This is the first of 3 virtually identical satellites for Viasat's third-generation network, following Viasat 1 and Viasat 2 already in service. Viasat 3 will extend the company's coverage from just over the Americas to a global market. This satellite will just cover the Americas, but 2 others will follow later this year and in 2024 to cover Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and the Asia-Pacific region. This spacecraft was built by Boeing. It has a launch mass of more than 13,000 pounds, or about 6 metric tons, and the Falcon Heavy will be placing this satellite into a near geosynchronous orbit, more than 21,500 miles, or about 34,600 kilometers over the equator. Viasat 3 Americas will then use its ion propulsion system to reach a circular orbit. It will raise itself about 700 miles or 1,100 kilometers higher using its own propulsion. That'll take a couple of weeks. And then it will unfurl a large reflector antenna that will be used to beam internet signals from the spacecraft down to users on the Earth. Also will extend solar panels that extend to a span of 144 feet or 44 meters. These are the largest commercial solar panels ever built for a spacecraft in Earth orbit, and will provide more than 30 kilowatts of electrical power for the spacecraft. That's about a quarter of the entire electrical output of all of the space station's solar arrays. Again, this mission is to serve the Americas and Viasat consumers across North and South America with Ka-band internet service, and each of these Viasat 3 satellites alone can provide more than 1 terabit per second of total throughput. Here's a look at the target orbit for tonight's mission. This is a very demanding mission requiring 3 burns of the Falcon Heavy's upper stage over the course of more than 4 hours, targeting a circular orbit 21,512 miles or 34,621 kilometers directly over the equator. So the rocket will not only have to boost the spacecraft up into this high circular orbit in a series of steps, but also will have to reduce the inclination from the latitude of the launch pad here, which is 28.5 degrees north, to 0 degrees directly over the equator. That will require 3 burns of the upper stage engine. And the upper stage for this mission has a custom band of gray paint. You may see that on the right side of your screen here. That is there to keep the kerosene fuel in that upper stage from freezing in the coast through the cold environment of space. We're now going to show a video from ViaSat. This is some B-roll footage. This shows their corporate headquarters out in Carlsbad, California, near San Diego. Viasat's been in business now for more than a decade. It's launched 2 satellites, Viasat 1 and 2 so far, and now has 3 more on the docket, beginning with tonight's mission, Viasat 3 Americas, to extend their coverage from just over the Americas to a global market. Here's a look inside of Viasat's Satellite Control Center, where the network is operated from. These satellites will provide internet service to rural consumers, airplane passengers, and ships at sea. Ground terminals from Viasat are sent out to the customers to connect to the satellites in geosynchronous orbit. Here's a look inside of Viasat's clean room, where they manufacture their Ka-band payloads for the Viasat 3 satellites. Those payloads are then shipped from this facility in Arizona to Boeing's factory, satellite factory near Los Angeles International Airport, where the payload modules are connected to the spacecraft bus itself. And then here's an artist's illustration of what the satellite looks like in orbit, with its very large solar arrays extended and that huge reflector on the end of a nearly 100-foot long boom. That reflector is used to beam the signals from the satellite down to consumers on the ground. We're now at 22 minutes until launch. We're now seeing the big vent from the strongback out at pad 39A. This is a vent of gaseous oxygen from the strongback in preparation for the chill down of the liquid oxygen loading line that will flow into the upper stage of the Falcon Heavy when that tank is filled beginning in about 3 minutes time. And at this time, the kerosene tank on stage 2 of the Falcon Heavy should be fully loaded.
Stage 2 RP1 load is complete.
And we've just heard that confirmation that the second stage kerosene load is complete. Coming up in about 90 seconds from the start of liquid oxygen loading on stage 2. (18 minutes 45 seconds now in the countdown. We should see this big vent from the strongback end shortly as liquid oxygen begins loading into the second stage of the Falcon Heavy.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
And there's confirmation that the second stage of the Falcon Heavy is now being filled with liquid oxygen. This liquid oxygen is conditioned down to a temperature of a few hundred degrees below zero, so it's very cold. And that's why you're seeing the frost and ice build up on the rocket as it's loaded into the vehicle. Now 17 minutes, 14 seconds and counting. Here's a look at some really spectacular footage from a SpaceX drone that flew around pad 39A last week, showing the 3 first stage boosters with different markings, different soot markings on them, because they all have different numbers of flights under their belts. One has flown twice, one is brand new, the other has flown 7 times. You can see here the spectacular view from the drone showing Pad 39A with the crew access arm on the right there. That's the arm that's used for astronauts boarding the SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft for human spaceflight missions. The Falcon Heavy, of course, designed for satellite launches. And I mentioned the different markings, different levels of darkening on each of the 3 boosters, indicating really how experienced each of these boosters are in terms of spaceflight. On the left-hand side in this view, from this vantage point, is booster 1053. It's flown on 2 previous Falcon Heavy missions back in 2019 and hasn't flown in nearly 4 years, and will be flying for the 3rd time tonight, and will be expended, of course, as all 3 boosters will be. The center core is brand new, booster 1068, going for its first and only mission. And then on the right-hand side, booster 1052, the veteran of the group, going for its 8th flight to space. It's flown both in Falcon Heavy configuration as well as on a series of Falcon 9 single-stick missions, most recently last September. Here's a look at the countdown timeline for the Falcon Heavy. We've already passed a few of these milestones. Propellant loading got underway at T-minus 50 minutes. And right now, the most recent milestone was at 18 minutes 30 seconds, with liquid oxygen loading confirmed to begin on stage 2 at that time. Looking ahead in the countdown, at T-minus 7 minutes, we'll see engine chill down of the 27 Merlin engines on the 3 first-stage booster cores. That involves flowing a little bit of liquid oxygen, this super cold oxidizer, through the engine plumbing to make sure all those components and all that hardware is conditioned and protected against the risk of thermal shock as that super cold fluid.
ViaSat 3 is on internal power. All payloads are go for launch.
As that super cold fluid flows into the engines in flight. We just heard the call from SpaceX that the ViaSat 3 America's satellite, the Boeing-built ViaSat-owned internet satellite on board Falcon Heavy, cocooned inside the payload fairing, is now switched to internal power. It's on its own batteries now and off of the ground power supply for the remainder of the countdown. It'll be running off of that battery supply up until it's deployed from the Falcon Heavy more than 4 hours into the flight tonight. That's when it will begin recharging its batteries and begin the process to deploy its solar arrays to that 140-foot span, or 44-meter span, which is nearly the wingspan, by the way, of a Boeing 767 jet. So that's giving you an idea of the scale of this ViaSat 3 America satellite, one of the most powerful satellites, commercial satellites at least, ever launched. Again, back to the countdown timeline here. At 4.5 minutes, we'll see the strong back retract from the Falcon Heavy to an angle of about 1.5 degrees, and then at about 2 minutes prior to liftoff, the Falcon Heavy should have its full load of more than 3 million pounds of propellant on board. And at T-minus 60 seconds, the control of the countdown will be handed from the ground computer to the Falcon Heavy's flight computer. That's known as the start of the so-called startup sequence for Falcon Heavy. And then at T-minus 20 seconds, propellant tanks will be pressurized for flight. Vent valves will be closed during that final minute of the countdown. And the engine ignition sequence for the 27 Merlin engines will begin at T-minus 6 seconds. If all looks good, if all those engines throttle up to full power and pass their automated health checks, the command will be given from the Falcon Heavy's onboard computer to release the clamps on the ground hold-down system to allow the rocket to begin its climb to space. Now less than 13 minutes remaining until liftoff. If you're just joining us, my name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now. I'm just about 3 miles from the Falcon Heavy launch pad, looking out at it right now from my vantage point here at Kennedy Space Center. Should be a beautiful launch with clear skies. A launch shortly after sunset here on Florida Space Coast, which is always a treat. And if you want to help us out, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us attract a larger audience for our coverage through the YouTube algorithm. And you can help us do that. Again, the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream really would be of great support to us. If you also want to support our coverage, help us purchase new equipment and bring you more views of these launches, One way to do that is to join our YouTube channel as a member. You can click the join button here. If you do that, you'll gain a menu or see a menu of membership levels depending on which membership tier you choose. You can gain access to bonus members-only video features, and you'll be helping us bring you coverage like this for every launch here at Cape Canaveral and some launches at other locations around the world. Also want to thank those of you who have supported us through the Super Chats this evening, most recently SG for their support. The Super Chat here on our YouTube channel is another way to help us with contributions to support our coverage. Now 10 minutes, 44 seconds remaining in tonight's Falcon Heavy countdown. Now 9 minutes, 6 seconds and counting. Here's a look at the SpaceX mission patch for this launch, showing illustrations of the ViaSat 3 Americas satellite with those large solar panels extended and that huge mesh reflector built by Northrop Grumman also deployed in its final configuration as it will appear in orbit. Also, this patch shows an illustration of the Falcon Heavy launching with all 27 engines on those 3 first-stage boosters firing. This will mark the 21st orbital launch attempt of the year from here at Kennedy Space Center or at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. You can see here in recent years the number of launches has drastically increased, and this year they're currently on pace to match or possibly slightly exceed the number of launches we saw last year here on Florida's Space Coast.
Center core RP1 load complete.
The center core of the Falcon Heavy now has its full supply of kerosene fuel. We should hear similar calls in the next few moments for the 2 side boosters, that those kerosene tanks are also fully loaded for flight.
PY booster RP1 load complete.
Approaching T-minus 7 minutes now. The next milestone will be the chill down of the 27 Merlin engines. This is a thermal conditioning step to make sure those engines
Engine chill has started.
Are protected against the risk of thermal shock at ignition. And we just heard that call from SpaceX that the engine chill down has started.
NY booster RP1 load complete.
Now 5 minutes, 30 seconds until liftoff. Everything looking good right now here at Kennedy Space Center for launch of SpaceX's 6th Falcon Heavy mission. Here's a look at the ground track map tonight. This Falcon Heavy will be heading due east from Kennedy Space Center out over the Atlantic Ocean, targeting this equatorial orbit, more than 21,000 miles over the equator. To reach that orbit over the equator, the Falcon Heavy needs to head due east, and that's the track you see here on this map. We've not labeled the drone ship or any landing maneuvers on this map because all 3 first stage boosters will be expended because this mission is a demanding one from a technical perspective.
Falcon Heavy tanks are pressurizing for strong back retract.
Falcon Heavy needs to devote all of its propellant to boosting the ViaSat 3 America satellite and the 2 secondary payloads for Astronis Space Technologies and Gravity Space. These are 2 much smaller satellites hitching a ride to orbit tonight into this high-altitude perch over the equator. And here's a look at the launch timeline.
Strongback retract in progress.
As we hear confirmation that the strongback is retracting into position for engine start. That'll recline to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon Heavy in the next few moments. I won't go through all of these steps, but as you can see, the 2 side boosters will burn for about 3 minutes, the core stage about a minute longer, and then the second stage will take over for 3 firings with its Merlin vacuum engine over the course of more than 4 hours to reach the final orbit, 21,500 miles over the equator, setting up for separation of the ViaSat 3 America satellite at 4.5 hours into the flight, followed by those 2 secondary payloads a few minutes later.
NY booster LOX load complete. PY booster LOX load complete.
Now approaching the T-minus 3 minute mark, I'm going to hand off to my colleague Stephen Young, who is going to provide some commentary in the final minutes of the countdown and the first phases of the flight while I operate the camera here at Kennedy Space Center. Stephen, all yours.
Thank you, Stephen. We're now less than 3 minutes to the launch
Center
of the
core, LOX
6th
load
Falcon
complete.
Heavy. Then we have confirmation that liquid oxygen load is complete on the core of the Falcon Heavy, the core first stage. In the next minute, all propellants will be aboard the Falcon Heavy. T-minus 2 minutes.
Second stage LOX load is complete.
We have confirmation that the loading of liquid oxygen aboard the second stage is now complete. The rocket should now be fully fueled at T-minus 1 minute. The onboard computers will take control of the countdown. The 27 Merlin engines at the base of the Falcon Heavy will produce 5 million pounds of thrust during today's launch.
Gas closeouts.
Propellant tanks are being pressurized for flight. Coming up on T-minus 1 minute.
Falcon Heavy is in startup.
And we have confirmation that the onboard computers have taken control of the countdown. The ignition of those 27 Merlin engines will begin just seconds before liftoff. They won't reach full thrust. They won't reach full thrust until after liftoff, and we have a go for launch from the launch director. T-minus 25 minutes, 25 seconds. 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of the Falcon Heavy, carrying the ViaSat 3 into orbit. Now beginning to hear the rumble of those Merlin engines as the vehicle pitches downrange. In a few minutes, those engines will throttle down. Power and telemetry are reported nominal. The Falcon Heavy is supersonic and is approaching the period of maximum dynamic pressure. SpaceX confirms that the Falcon 9 has passed max Q. That's the point where there's maximum stress on the vehicle. Those 27 Merlin engines throttled down to reduce those stresses. They'll be throttling back up to propel the Falcon Heavy into orbit. Falcon 9 leaving a spectacular trail in the night sky. Heading downrange. Got about 1 minute left before the side boosters cut off and are jettisoned. SpaceX reports the Falcon Heavy is following a nominal trajectory. Switching to a view from SpaceX's onboard cameras. I believe on the left side of the screen, we're seeing a ground view. This video comes with a little bit of delay, as you can tell by the difference in times between the countdown clock. but we should be coming up on separation of those side boosters.
MVAC engine chill has started. Booster engine cutoff.
Side booster separation confirmed. Both side boosters
There we have,
FTS has safed.
there we have separation of the side boosters. The core stage will continue to fire. Normally those boosters would be returning to the launch site for a landing, but because all their energy was needed for this liftoff, they will be expended and fall into the ocean. Getting a spectacular view here from our camera at the Kennedy Space Center, showing the plume from the core stage of the Falcon Heavy. Switching back to the view from SpaceX. Coming up on cutoff of the core stage.
Cutoff.
And there we have it, main engine cutoff.
Stage separation.
Separation.
Stage 1 FTS has safed.
Core stage is separated from the second stage,
ignition.
and the Merlin vacuum engine has ignited.
Acquisition signal, Bermuda.
You see that engine glowing bright red as it builds up thrust to propel the ViaSat 3 satellite towards geostationary orbit. This is a look inside the payload fairing as we come up on separation.
Confirmed.
And we have confirmation of fairing separation.
Following a nominal trajectory.
Here we can see the course of the Falcon Heavy's upper stage as it heads east from the Kennedy Space Center. Spectacular views, as always, coming from SpaceX's onboard cameras. There are actually two different cameras on either side of the stage, and SpaceX switches between them, and you'll notice the jump as it happens there.
Stage 2 continues to follow a nominal trajectory.
We have about another 2 minutes, less than 2 minutes now for the second stage, the first burn of the second stage. You can see the velocity building. Now about a minute left in this burn. This was the 6th launch of a Falcon Heavy and the 2nd Falcon Heavy to fly this year.
Stage 2 FTS has safed. Stage 2 has entered terminal guidance.
Coming up on the cutoff of the second stage.
Expected loss of signal, Cape.
And there we have it. Visual confirmation of the cutoff of the second stage. Completes the first burn of the second stage of the Falcon Heavy. 2 more burns are planned to raise the orbit. SpaceX has confirmed that the second stage is reached the planned orbit.
Thank you, Stephen, for your help with commentary for the launch of the Falcon Heavy tonight from here at Kennedy Space Center. It was quite a show. Shortly after sunset, about 30 minutes or so after sunset here, is when the Falcon Heavy lifted off. And those twilight launches are always a sight to behold. And seeing a Falcon Heavy at twilight, even better. We were able to track the rocket all the way until shortly after ignition of the second stage. As it moved farther down range, it got hard to see. But the Falcon Heavy climbed into some sunlight. It caught some orange hues from the sun as it rocketed through the stratosphere. And then as it reached over the von Karman line, over 100 kilometers altitude, it was actually turning into a bright white plume as the exhaust particles were illuminated by the sun on the western horizon. Obviously, it is now dark here at the ground level here at Kennedy Space Center. We're still seeing some of the exhaust plume in the sky off to the east, twisting in the upper level winds. So a great start to SpaceX's 6th Falcon Heavy mission, although the Falcon Heavy still has quite a bit of work to do. 2 more engine burns by the upper stage engine still to come. One of those is about less than 20 minutes away, and the 3rd and final burn by that upper stage engine is now still more than 4 hours away. So it's a long route to the near geosynchronous orbit that is the destination for tonight's Falcon Heavy mission.
Expected loss of signal, Bermuda.
Now 13 minutes, 12 seconds into the Falcon Heavy's launch with the ViaSat 3 Americas mission, as well as 2 rideshare payloads for customers Astronus and Gravity Space. Those are 2 smaller satellites hitching a ride to orbit tonight with ViaSat 3 Americas. Those 3 satellites still attached to the Falcon Heavy upper stage, currently over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, as you can see here in this tracking map from SpaceX, heading toward the west coast of Africa. We're going to stay live for a little while longer tonight as we await the second burn of the Falcon Heavy's upper stage engine. For those of you just joining us, if you haven't done so, if you want to support our coverage and you like what we do, please consider joining our memberships here on our YouTube channel. You can click the join button right below the video box here on our channel, and you'll get a menu of options for different membership tiers that we've laid out for you. Depending on which level you select, you can gain access to bonus members-only video features that we've produced just for our supporters, and you will also be supporting our coverage. You'll be helping us with equipment, with time, and helping us get out here to Kennedy Space Center for every single launch. And it is, with the ever-growing rate of launches, that is a challenge sometimes. So your support goes a long way in that regard. You can also support our coverage with the Super Chat function here on YouTube. We appreciate those of you who have supported us in the Super Chat tonight as well. Most recently, we want to give a shout out to Watchdog JJ and Mike Miller for becoming members of our YouTube channel. And for those of you who we haven't been able to see in the chat scroll tonight, as we've been busy covering this launch, we're sorry we're not able to call out the names of all of you, but we do appreciate your support. Also, a big thank you to Josh King for your support as well. So as I said, we're going to stay live for a little while longer. We're going to cover the second burn of the Falcon Heavy upper stage, which is about 13 minutes away here on our live stream. Also, a big thank you to YouTube user SG for your support tonight. Thanks to all of you. Now 22 minutes 15 seconds since liftoff of the Falcon Heavy rocket. As you can see in this tracking map from SpaceX, the upper stage continues its mission, currently over Africa, heading east. It'll soon be passing over the Gulf of Guinea and then making a swing over the southern part of the African continent. Restart of the upper stage Merlin engine is now about 7 minutes away.
Acquisition signal about.
We're now about 2.5 minutes away from the restart of the Falcon Heavy's upper stage engine. This restart is scheduled to begin at about 29 minutes and 42 seconds after liftoff. So as you can see, it's about 2 minutes and 10 seconds from now. This burn will last a little more than 2 minutes in duration. The Falcon Heavy upper stage engine, the Merlin vacuum, produces more than 200,000 pounds of thrust. So we'll be firing that engine for a little more than 2 minutes. This will boost or raise the apogee or high point of the rocket's orbit up to a geostationary altitude, near geostationary altitude, more than 20,000 miles or nearly 35,000 kilometers over the equator. This burn will actually raise that apogee up to that altitude and also will take out some inclination from the orbit. The rocket launched from here at Kennedy Space Center, which is about 28.5 degrees north latitude. The satellite needs to go to an orbit at 0 degrees latitude, positioned right over the equator. So not only does the rocket have to do the impulse required to reach that high altitude orbit, it also has to redirect the orbit over the equator, and this upcoming burn will do a lot of that work for the ViaSat 3 Americas satellite. This will be followed by a coast of nearly 4 hours. So the third burn won't start until 4 hours and 22 minutes after liftoff. That will be when the rocket and the spacecraft reach that geosynchronous or near geosynchronous altitude, more than 20,000 miles up. And when it reaches that position, the rocket will reignite the engine for about a minute for a final burn to reshape the orbit from the elliptical transfer orbit to a circular orbit, setting the stage for payload deployment. Now less than 30 seconds, or about 30 seconds, away from engine restart. This restart occurring as the rocket is flying over Africa in range of a ground station in Gabon. And there's engine ignition. Merlin vacuum engine now firing. This burn will last about 2 minutes. You can see the velocity on the lower right increasing as the vehicle gets thrust from this engine. It's flying about 180 kilometers. That's about 120 miles above the Earth over Africa. That engine nozzle glowing red hot as the superheated exhaust exits that engine bell. That's entirely normal. Now 29,000 kilometers per hour and accelerating.
Expected loss of signal, Gabon.
So the rocket has flown outside of the range of the ground station in Libreville, Gabon. It should be picked up by a tracking station in perhaps likely either Kenya or South Africa in a few moments. The burn should still be ongoing. Still about 20 seconds remaining in the burn according to SpaceX's mission timeline. And we should be now at the point of engine cutoff. So the burn should be complete, but we'll await confirmation of that and a nominal orbit insertion to make sure that the rocket has achieved its planned transfer orbit once the rocket is back in range of a ground station.
Acquisition of signal, Malindi.
Nominal transfer orbit.
And the rocket is now back in range of the Malindi, Kenya ground station on the east coast of Kenya. That ground station has now received signals from the Falcon Heavy upper stage, and the telemetry indicates that the rocket has reached its planned transfer orbit. So the rocket is now in an elliptical or oval-shaped orbit ranging from a perigee or low point of around 200 kilometers altitude, roughly, and an apogee or a high point more than 20,000 miles above the Earth, or about more than 35,000 kilometers above the Earth. Here's a look at the launch timeline this evening. So the most recent milestone was on this list SECO 2 at 31 minutes 46 seconds. That was the completion of the second burn by the upper stage engine. And as you can see, the rocket is going to be coasting for about 3 hours and 50 minutes until reigniting at about 12:48 a.m. Eastern Time, if my math is correct. That's about 4:48 a.m. UTC. That's when the action will resume, with the final burn of the upper stage engine, followed by the maneuvers to deploy all three satellites. ViaSat 3 Americas by far is the largest of the three, followed by Gravity Space GS1. That's a CubeSat that is expected to become the first commercial CubeSat in geostationary orbit. That spacecraft is what's known as a 12U CubeSat. It's about 25 kilograms or a little more than 50 pounds in mass, and will be performing a multitude of missions, including imaging, rendezvous and proximity operations demonstrations, and a communications mission as well. That'll be followed at 4 hours 45 minutes by the separation of the third and final spacecraft, the Arcturus spacecraft for the company Astronis. That spacecraft is scheduled to deploy at 4 hours 45 minutes. We talked quite a bit about the ViaSat 3 Americas satellite before liftoff. Before we end our live commentary coverage, we want to bring you some information on this rideshare payload. This is the larger of the two rideshares on this Falcon Heavy mission. This satellite is called Arcturus, also known as Aurora 4A. It's built and owned by a California-based company called Astronis Space Technologies, using a new satellite design that they developed, a small geostationary satellite bus with a mass of about 660 pounds or about 300 kilograms. It's in the microsatellite range in terms of mass. And this spacecraft will provide internet connectivity to consumers in Alaska for a company called Pacific Dataport. So Pacific Dataport is an internet service provider for Alaska. A lot of rural consumers in Alaska, as you might imagine. And Pacific Dataport has bought all the capacity on this dedicated satellite that will be providing internet connectivity to Pacific Dataport customers in Alaska once the satellite is on station in geostationary orbit later this year after some in-orbit checkouts. This is the first of a series of satellites of similar class and scale that Astronis plans to build and launch for different types of different types of clients, and most notably internet service providers, mainly in rural areas or developing nations. As you can see, the Falcon Heavy, with the three satellites still on board, is currently flying over the eastern coast of Madagascar, heading out over the Indian Ocean. On the lower right, the altitude is increasing 620 kilometers and rising, and as a result of that rising altitude, you can see the velocity is decreasing now at 34,000 kilometers and reducing speed as it climbs away from Earth, as Earth's gravity tugs on the rocket to slow it down. It's heading up to an altitude of more than 20,000 miles.
Acquisition of signal, Diego Garcia.
And when it reaches that altitude, that's when the upper stage engine is scheduled to reignite for the final maneuver to circularize this elliptical orbit and set up for payload separation.
Acquisition of signal, Maldives. Copy that, SC. Acquisition of signal, Western Australia.
Now 43 minutes since liftoff of the Falcon Heavy. Here's a look at some mission stats for tonight's flight. This was the 6th launch of a Falcon Heavy rocket by SpaceX since the debut demo mission in February of 2018. The 231st launch overall of SpaceX's Falcon rocket family since 2006. That includes Falcon 1s, Falcon 9s, and Falcon Heavies. The 3 first-stage boosters that SpaceX flew tonight, the core stage, booster 1068, was on its first flight. The 2 side boosters, 1053 and 1052, on their 3rd and 8th flight, respectively. These boosters were all disposed of. They impacted the Atlantic Ocean because SpaceX needed to use all of the propellant in all 3 boosters to give this 6 metric ton ViaSat 3 America's satellite a ride to geostationary, a near geostationary orbit. This was the 187th SpaceX launch from here on Florida's Space Coast, the 64th SpaceX launch from Launch Complex 39A. now 48 minutes since launch of the Falcon Heavy from Kennedy Space Center. I apologize for that technical glitch as I was running through these mission stats, but just picking up where I left off, this was the 64th SpaceX launch from Pad 39A, the 158th launch overall from Launch Complex 39A here at Kennedy Space Center, including Saturn V, Space Shuttles, Falcon 9s, and Falcon Heavies. This was the first SpaceX launch for ViaSat, the 28th SpaceX launch of the year, including Falcon 9s, Falcon Heavies, and the Starship test flight back on April the 20th from Texas. The second Falcon Heavy launch of the year, the 21st orbital launch attempt from here on Florida's Space Coast so far in 2023. And if tonight's mission completes successfully, this will be the 198th straight successful flight for a Falcon rocket since 2016, since the explosion of the Amos 6 mission during a launch pad test here at Cape Canaveral about 7 years ago now. Before we sign off, we also want to look ahead to our launches we'll be covering on spaceflightnow.com over the coming days. On Tuesday, no earlier than Tuesday night U.S. time, Rocket Lab will be launching an Electron launch vehicle from down in New Zealand with NASA's Tropics 3 and 4 spacecraft on board. These are two small satellites designed to study tropical cyclones and hurricane development. This is the second pair of a total of 6 Tropics satellites that were developed as part of this small satellite constellation. The first 2 were lost in a launch failure last year from Cape Canaveral on an Astra Rocket 3 vehicle. Those satellites were lost during that launch failure and crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. And NASA has switched over to Rocket Lab to carry the next 4 Tropics satellites into orbit after that Astra malfunction. SpaceX's next launch is scheduled for Thursday, May the 4th, in the very early hours of the morning, around 3:30 a.m. Eastern Time, 7:30 a.m. UTC, with the Starlink 5-6 mission from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We'll be here live at the launch site, streaming that here on our YouTube channel. 2 days later, another Falcon 9 is scheduled to launch from out at Vandenberg Space Force Base with another batch of Starlink Internet satellites that is targeted for May the 6th. And then on May the 10th, China plans to launch their Long March 7 rocket with an unpiloted cargo ship heading up to their Tiangong space station. This cargo ship, called Tianzhou 6, will be carrying equipment, experiments, and supplies to the crew, the 3-person crew, on board China's space station. So those are the launches of the next week to week and a half that we'll be covering on spaceflightnow.com. May is shaping up to be another busy month in launch activity for SpaceX and other launch companies around the world, and we'll be here to bring you those launch events live. We're going to continue our coverage over on our Launchpad live stream during this long duration coast of the upper stage of the Falcon Heavy. We hope to get some occasional views from the onboard camera if SpaceX provides those to us. If we do, we'll bring those to you on our Launchpad live stream, and of course there will be some updates later in the evening and overnight for the deployment of the ViaSat 3 Americas satellite from the rocket, as well as the 2 rideshare payloads. Those events need to occur as planned before SpaceX can declare mission success for this Falcon Heavy launch. So I'm going to sign off from our live launch commentary here at Kennedy Space Center. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now. I want to thank my colleague Stephen Young for his commentary support during the liftoff, as well as video production support for our coverage. So until next time, thanks for joining us on this Falcon Heavy launch tonight, the 6th SpaceX Falcon Heavy.
Acquisition of signal, Tasmania.
And we'll have continuing coverage on our Mission Status Center at spaceflightnow.com and on our Launchpad live stream. Have a great night.
Acquisition of signal, Hobart.